When people think about the first computer, a very specific image tends to come to mind: a massive machine filling an entire room, cables everywhere, blinking lights, military engineers in white shirts and ties, and an unspoken conclusion that this technological birth happened in the United States, during World War II, as a natural extension of American scientific dominance, and for decades. That image has had a name attached to it, ENIAC, often presented as the first true electronic computer. The starting point of the digital age, and the foundation upon which everything else was built. But that version of the story, while convenient, is incomplete, and like many simplified origin stories in technology, it hides more than it reveals, because long before ENIAC was unveiled to the public, and even before American laboratories began assembling room-sized machines, other inventors, working under very different circumstances, had already solved many of the same problems, sometimes more elegantly, sometimes earlier, and often without the recognition that would later define who invented the computer. This documentary is not about denying the importance of American contributions to computing, because they were undeniably significant, but it is about asking a more uncomfortable question, one that history rarely encourages us to ask: what if the first computer was not American at all, and what if the reason we remember it that way has less to do with innovation, and more to do with power, timing, and narrative control? Before we go any further, if you enjoy deep dives into forgotten technological battles and the stories behind how innovation is credited, consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you might think, and it allows us to keep exploring the hidden side of technological history without rushing through it. To understand how this myth took shape, we need to rewind to a time before computers were devices you could recognize, a time when computation was a human activity performed by people rather than machines, and when the word computer itself referred to a job title, not a product, because in the early 20th century, calculations were done by hand, with mechanical aids at best, and the idea of a fully automated electronic machine capable of general-purpose computation was still more theoretical than practical. The early need for such machines came not from curiosity, but from pressure, specifically military pressure, because modern warfare demanded calculations at a scale and speed that humans could not sustain. Ballistics tables, artillery trajectories, cryptography, logistics, and later nuclear research all required an unprecedented level of mathematical precision, and it was this pressure that pushed multiple countries, almost simultaneously, toward the same technological horizon. This is where the story becomes more complex than a single invention, because while the United States was developing ENIAC, other nations were working on their own solutions, often in secrecy, often under extreme conditions, and sometimes years ahead in specific aspects of computing. But history tends to reward not the first to build, but the first to tell the story publicly, and this distinction will matter a lot as we move forward. One of the most important things to understand is that the first computer depends entirely on how we define a computer, because there is no single, universally agreed upon definition that neatly separates computers from advanced calculators, and that ambiguity has been used repeatedly to include some machines while excluding others, often retroactively, and often in ways that favor a particular narrative. Is a computer required to be electronic, or can it be electromechanical? Does it need to be programmable, and if so, how programmable? Must it be general purpose, or can it be task-specific? And who gets to decide these criteria after the fact? Because these definitions are not neutral, they shape history itself, and as we'll see, they were often adjusted to ensure that ENIAC remained comfortably at the center of the story. ENIAC, the electronic numerical integrator and computer, was officially unveiled in 1946, and it was indeed a remarkable machine, capable of performing thousands of calculations per second using vacuum tubes, far faster than anything that came before it in the United States, and its creators, John Mauchly and J. Presper Eckert, became central figures in the American computing narrative, celebrated in textbooks, museums, and documentaries. But even at the moment of its unveiling, ENIAC was not operating in a vacuum, intellectually or historically, because similar ideas, and in some cases similar machines, already existed elsewhere, and the reason they are less well known has very little to do with their technical merit, and a lot to do with secrecy, classification, and post-war storytelling. To see this clearly, we need to leave the United States for a moment and look toward Europe, where two parallel lines of development were unfolding, one in Britain, under the intense secrecy of wartime codebreaking, and another in Germany, under conditions that would later make recognition politically inconvenient. In Britain, at Bletchley Park, a team of mathematicians and engineers was working on a machine called Colossus, designed to help break encrypted German communications, and Colossus was not a theoretical device, it was a fully electronic, programmable machine built and operating during the war, years before ENIAC was revealed, and yet for decades, its existence was classified, its creators sworn to silence, and its role erased from public history. Colossus challenges the ENIAC first narrative in uncomfortable ways, because it was electronic, it was programmable, and it was operational, but because it was designed for a specific task and kept secret for national security reasons, it was excluded from early computing histories, not because it failed to meet technical criteria, but because acknowledging it would complicate a cleaner, more marketable story. At the same time, in Germany, an engineer named Konrad Zuse was working largely alone, building a series of machines that introduced ideas far ahead of their time, including binary arithmetic and programmable logic, and his Z3 machine, completed in 1941, is considered by many historians to be the first functional, programmable computer, albeit electromechanical rather than fully electronic. Zuse's work is often sidelined for two main reasons: first because it was not electronic in the same way ENIAC was, and second because post-war politics made it uncomfortable to center a German inventor in the origin story of modern computing, especially given the broader context of World War II, but technical discomfort and political discomfort are not the same thing, and conflating the two has had long-lasting consequences for how history is told. And then there is a third figure, whose story will become increasingly important as this documentary unfolds: John Vincent Atanasoff, an American physicist working with his graduate student Clifford Berry, who developed the Atanasoff-Berry computer, or ABC, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, a machine that introduced key concepts such as electronic computation and binary arithmetic, but lacked programmability in the way later machines would achieve. The ABC occupies a strange position in this story, because it is both American and often excluded, and its treatment reveals just how flexible historical definitions can be when patents, lawsuits, and reputation are involved, because while the ABC was not a general-purpose computer, many of its ideas directly influenced later designs, including ENIAC itself, a connection that would only become legally significant decades later. All of this raises a fundamental problem with the way we talk about invention, because innovation does not move in straight lines, it moves in overlapping waves, and when multiple people solve similar problems at roughly the same time, credit tends to go not to the earliest or the most elegant solution, but to the one that aligns best with institutional power and public visibility. By the end of World War II, the United States emerged not only as a military superpower, but as a cultural and scientific authority, and this status gave American institutions an enormous advantage in defining the historical record, because history is not written only by the victors, it is published by them, taught by them, and repeated by them, until alternative versions fade into obscurity. This is the environment in which ENIAC became enshrined as the first computer, not because it was the only candidate, but because it was the most visible, the most public, and the most narratively convenient, and once that story took hold, it became self-reinforcing, repeated in textbooks, museums, and documentaries, often without mentioning the machines that came before or alongside it. In the next part, we'll slow down and examine each of these competing machines more closely, not to crown a single winner, but to understand how and why certain contributions were elevated while others were minimized, and how definitions were quietly adjusted to support a preferred outcome. So take a moment to let this question sit with you: if the first computer was not American, why do so many of us believe it was? And what does that say about how technological history is constructed? To understand why the question of the first computer remains so contested, we have to confront something that usually stays hidden in popular history: the fact that definitions often come after inventions, not before them, and once an invention becomes symbolically important, those definitions tend to bend in its favor, because the goal quietly shifts from understanding what happened to justifying what is already believed. In the early 20th century, there was no clear boundary separating calculators, computing machines, and computers. These were all evolving concepts, and engineers were experimenting across a wide spectrum of designs: mechanical, electromechanical, and electronic, each with its own advantages and limitations, and at the time, no one was trying to win a historical race, they were trying to solve immediate, practical problems under intense pressure. Only later, once computing became recognized as a foundational technology, did the race narrative emerge, and with it came a retroactive sorting process. Machines were labeled as true computers, or not quite computers, based on criteria that conveniently aligned with the most visible success story, and this sorting process is where many early innovators quietly lost their place in history. One of the most common criteria used to elevate ENIAC is that it was fully electronic, relying on vacuum tubes rather than mechanical relays, and this distinction matters, because electronic systems are faster and more scalable, but speed alone does not define a computer, and if it did, many modern devices would fail to qualify, because computation is fundamentally about logic, programmability, and the ability to manipulate symbols according to defined rules. This is why Konrad Zuse's work is so important, because his machines, particularly the Z3, introduced concepts that are now considered essential to modern computing, including binary arithmetic, floating-point calculations, and program-controlled operation, all implemented in a working machine completed in 1941, several years before ENIAC was unveiled. And while the Z3 used electromechanical relays rather than vacuum tubes, its logical structure was astonishingly modern. The reason Zuse's work remained marginal in early computing histories is often framed as a technical issue, that relay-based machines were inherently limited, but that explanation misses the broader context. Zuse was working in wartime Germany, with limited resources, frequent bombings, and almost no institutional support, and after the war, the political and cultural climate made it deeply uncomfortable to place a German inventor at the foundation of a technology that would soon symbolize modernity and progress. At the same time, British contributions faced a different kind of erasure, not political discomfort, but enforced silence, because the Colossus machines built at Bletchley Park were classified for decades, and their existence was known only to a small group of people bound by secrecy laws, and this classification meant that early historians of computing simply did not have access to the full picture, and so they wrote histories based on what they could see. Colossus complicates the narrative even further, because it meets many of the criteria later used to define a computer. It was electronic, it was programmable to a degree, and it processed data at speeds unmatched at the time, but because it was designed for cryptanalysis rather than general-purpose computation, it was often excluded, even though that exclusion reflects a preference rather than a necessity. What's important here is not to argue that Colossus or the Z3 should automatically replace ENIAC as the first computer, but to recognize that the hierarchy itself was constructed, and once constructed, it became a powerful filter through which all subsequent discussion had to pass, shaping not only public understanding, but academic discourse as well. This filtering process became even more consequential when patents entered the story, because legal systems demand clear definitions, and ambiguity is dangerous in court, and as we'll see later, the question of who invented the computer was not just a matter of pride, it became a matter of ownership, money, and control over the future of computing. At this stage, it's worth pausing to notice something subtle. The more foundational a contribution is, the harder it is to defend as a standalone invention, because foundational ideas tend to spread, mutate, and reappear in multiple places at once, and this diffusion makes it easier for later, more visible systems to claim primacy, even if they were not the first to implement the underlying concepts. This is why ENIAC's story became dominant, not because it stood alone, but because it arrived at the perfect intersection of timing, visibility, and institutional support. The war was over, secrecy was lifting, American universities and industries were expanding rapidly, and there was a growing appetite for symbols of technological progress, and ENIAC fit that role perfectly. Meanwhile, earlier machines were either destroyed, like many of Zuse's prototypes, or dismantled and hidden, like Colossus, or left unfinished and uncommercialized, like the Atanasoff buried computer, and once physical artifacts disappear, stories become easier to overwrite, because there is nothing concrete to point to, only documents, memories, and contested interpretations. As computing moved from a wartime necessity to a peacetime industry, the emphasis shifted from experimentation to standardization, and standardization favors clarity over complexity, and it was far simpler to teach a single origin story than to explain a tangled web of parallel developments across multiple countries, languages, and political systems. If this is making you rethink how firsts are assigned in technology, that's exactly the point, because firsts are rarely discovered, they are chosen, and the criteria used to choose them tell us as much about power and narrative as they do about innovation itself. In the next part, we'll focus more closely on ENIAC itself, not to diminish its importance, but to place it in its proper context, examining how its design, publicity, and later legal battles shaped the historical record, and why the question of who invented the computer would eventually be decided not in a laboratory, but in a courtroom. By the time ENIAC entered the public imagination, it was no longer just a machine, it was a symbol, and symbols have a strange way of attracting ownership claims, because once something becomes important enough, controlling its story can be just as valuable as controlling the technology itself. ENIAC was unveiled in 1946 with enormous fanfare, newspapers called it a giant brain, photographs showed towering walls of vacuum tubes, and the narrative was simple and powerful. America had built the world's first electronic computer, and it worked, and this story landed at exactly the right historical moment, when the United States was emerging from World War II not just victorious, but technologically confident, eager to define the future in its own image. Technically speaking, ENIAC was extraordinary. It could perform calculations at speeds previously unimaginable, and for tasks like ballistic trajectory computation, it represented a massive leap forward, but its limitations were rarely emphasized in popular accounts, because they complicated the story. ENIAC was not originally stored program, meaning that reprogramming it required physically rewiring panels and switches, a process that could take days, and in practice, this meant it behaved more like a highly flexible calculator than what we would now call a general-purpose computer. Those limitations didn't matter much at first, because ENIAC wasn't competing in a philosophical debate, it was competing for attention, funding, and legitimacy, and in that arena, spectacle mattered, and ENIAC delivered spectacle in a way few earlier machines could. It was large, loud, visibly electronic, and easy to photograph, and these qualities helped cement its place in the public mind. But the real turning point came not from engineering, but from law, specifically patent law, because once Eckert and Mauchly, ENIAC's primary designers, filed patents claiming broad ownership over the concept of electronic digital computing, the question of who invented the computer stopped being abstract, it became financially explosive. If those patents held, they would grant enormous control over the emerging computer industry, and unsurprisingly, other researchers and institutions pushed back, arguing that the ideas behind ENIAC were not entirely original, and that prior work had laid essential groundwork long before ENIAC was built. At the center of this challenge was a machine that had never enjoyed ENIAC's fame, the Atanasoff Berry computer, or ABC, developed in the late 1930s and early 1940s at Iowa State College by John Atanasoff and Clifford Berry, and unlike ENIAC, the ABC used binary arithmetic, electronic components, and separated memory from computation, ideas that would later become standard in digital computing. The ABC was never fully operational in the way ENIAC was, and it was never commercialized, but its existence posed a serious problem for the ENIAC patent claims, especially because John Mauchly had visited Atanasoff, studied the machine, and discussed its principles before beginning work on ENIAC, a fact that would later become central in court. In 1973, decades after the machines themselves were built, a U.S. federal court issued a decision that quietly detonated the dominant origin story, ruling that the ENIAC patent was invalid, and that the key ideas behind electronic digital computing had been derived, at least in part, from Atanasoff's earlier work. This ruling did not declare the ABC, the first computer, in a celebratory sense, but it did something arguably more important: it broke the legal monopoly over the narrative, making it impossible to claim ENIAC as a singular act of invention divorced from its predecessors. What's fascinating is how little this ruling changed popular understanding. Textbooks continued to emphasize ENIAC, documentaries repeated the familiar story, and the court decision became a footnote rather than a headline, and this reveals something uncomfortable about how technological history works. Once a story becomes culturally dominant, legal truth alone is often not enough to dislodge it. Part of the reason is that legal decisions deal in narrow questions: patents, derivation, originality, while public narratives crave heroes, moments, and clean beginnings, and ENIAC still fit that narrative better than a partially completed machine in a university basement or a web of parallel inventions spread across continents. Meanwhile, the broader international context remained fragmented. Zuse's work was being rediscovered slowly, British contributions were only beginning to be openly discussed, and by the time historians had access to the full archive, the idea of an American first computer was already deeply embedded in education, media, and collective memory. What the ENIAC court case ultimately shows is that invention is rarely a single event. It is a process, shaped by conversations, shared ideas, forgotten prototypes, and incremental breakthroughs, and when the law tries to compress that process into a single name or date, something important is always lost. And yet, even with the patent invalidated, ENIAC's symbolic power remained intact, because symbols don't operate on evidence alone, they operate on repetition, and ENIAC had decades of repetition on its side. In the next part, we'll step back from the courtroom and look at the bigger picture, comparing ENIAC, Colossus, Zuse's machines, and the ABC side by side, not to crown a winner, but to ask a better question: what does it really mean to invent a computer, and why do we feel such a strong need to name just one? By the time we line up ENIAC, Colossus, Zuse's machines, and the Atanasoff Berry computer side by side, something strange happens. The question, which one came first, starts to feel less important than the question we should have been asking all along: what exactly are we talking about when we say the word computer? Because depending on how you define that word, the answer changes dramatically, and this is where the myth of a single origin really begins to fall apart. If we define a computer as an electronic machine, ENIAC seems like the obvious winner, but electronics alone are not enough, because Colossus was electronic too, and it predates ENIAC, yet for decades it was excluded from the conversation entirely, not because it failed technically, but because it was wrapped in secrecy, its existence classified long after the war ended, which means it never had the chance to shape the public narrative the way ENIAC did. If we define a computer as programmable, things get even more complicated, because ENIAC's original programming process was manual and physical, involving cables and switches, while Zuse's machines used punched film and later punched tape, allowing programs to be changed without rebuilding the machine itself, and by that standard, Zuse's work looks surprisingly modern, even though it was developed in near isolation, under bombings, with limited resources, and almost no institutional support. If we define a computer as binary and digital, then the Atanasoff Berry computer becomes impossible to ignore, because it introduced binary arithmetic and electronic switching in a way that directly influenced later designs, even if it never reached full operational maturity, and this highlights an uncomfortable truth, that we often equate, first, with commercially successful, or widely known, rather than conceptually foundational. And then there is the stored program concept, often credited to the post-ENIAC von Neumann architecture, which fundamentally changed what computers could be, turning them from specialized calculating engines into flexible, general-purpose machines. But even here, the story is not clean, because ideas about stored programs were already circulating, discussed informally among researchers, hinted at in earlier designs, and shaped collectively rather than invented in isolation. What emerges from this comparison is not a clear winner, but a mosaic, each machine contributing a crucial piece to what we now recognize as computing. Colossus demonstrated large-scale electronic computation, Zuse showed programmability and abstraction, Atanasoff introduced digital logic and separation of memory and computation, and ENIAC proved that such machines could be built at scale and funded seriously by governments. So when people say, the first computer was American, what they are often really saying is that the first computer they were taught about was American, and that distinction matters, because education shapes memory, and memory shapes identity, especially national identity, and technology has always been one of the most powerful tools for reinforcing narratives about progress and leadership. This is not about diminishing American contributions, which were immense and transformative, but about recognizing how historical framing can simplify complex realities into comforting myths, especially during periods like the Cold War, when technological supremacy was not just a matter of pride, but a strategic necessity. The idea of a single inventor, a single machine, and a single birthplace makes history easier to tell, but it also makes it less true, because innovation rarely respects borders, timelines, or neat categories, and the computer, more than almost any other invention, was born out of overlapping efforts, shared ideas, and parallel discoveries happening under very different political and social conditions. Once you accept that, the question shifts from who was first to why did some stories survive while others were buried, and the answer usually leads back to power, access, secrecy, and storytelling, not just engineering. ENIAC had publicity, patents, photographs, and institutional backing, Colossus had secrecy, Zuse had isolation, Atanasoff had obscurity, and these factors mattered just as much as technical merit in determining who would be remembered and who would be forgotten. This doesn't mean history is a lie, but it does mean history is curated, shaped by what societies choose to emphasize and what they quietly set aside, and once a narrative becomes dominant, challenging it requires more than facts, it requires attention, repetition, and sometimes a willingness to feel uncomfortable about what we thought we knew. And this is where the story connects directly to the present, because the way we talk about the origins of computing influences how we think about innovation today, who we credit, who we fund, and whose ideas we take seriously, and myths of singular genius can blind us to the collaborative, global nature of real technological progress. In the final part, we'll pull all of this together, not to declare a winner, but to explain why the myth of the first computer persists, why it matters, and what we lose when we cling to it too tightly. Even after you strip away the headlines, the patents, the courtroom battles, and the national pride, one question still lingers quietly beneath the surface: why do we care so much about being first, and more specifically, why does the idea of the first computer still provoke debate, discomfort, and defensiveness decades later, when the machines themselves have long since become museum pieces? Part of the answer lies in how technological origin stories function almost like modern creation myths. They give us a clear beginning, a hero, and a sense of inevitability, and once that structure is in place, it becomes emotionally difficult to accept that the truth might be messier, more distributed, and less flattering to any single nation or individual. The American ENIAC narrative arrived at a moment when the world was hungry for symbols of progress, and the United States, emerging from World War II as a global superpower, had both the means and the motivation to promote a story that linked technological dominance with national identity, and over time, that story solidified not because it was entirely false, but because it was simple, repeatable, and useful. Meanwhile, alternative narratives struggled to survive for reasons that had little to do with engineering merit. Colossus remained classified, Zuse's work was geographically and politically isolated, Atanasoff lacked institutional backing, and none of them benefited from the same combination of timing, visibility, and narrative momentum that ENIAC enjoyed. What makes this particularly important today is that we still rely on these simplified stories when we talk about innovation, startups, and breakthroughs, often framing progress as the result of lone geniuses rather than networks of ideas, collaborators, and incremental advances, and this framing can distort how credit is assigned and how future innovation is supported. When we celebrate only the final, visible product, we risk undervaluing the foundational work that makes those products possible, and in doing so, we create a system that rewards spectacle over substance, recognition over contribution, and storytelling over context. The history of computing shows us that transformative technology rarely appears fully formed, it emerges through trial, error, and shared experimentation, often across borders and under radically different conditions, and the fact that several first computers can all plausibly claim legitimacy is not a weakness of history, it is a reflection of how innovation actually works. This also explains why the myth persists despite academic corrections and legal rulings, because myths are resilient, they survive not by resisting evidence, but by absorbing it selectively, allowing footnotes and caveats while preserving the central narrative structure intact. But understanding this process gives us something valuable. It allows us to see technological history not as a sequence of isolated miracles, but as a continuum, where progress is built collaboratively, sometimes unknowingly, and often unevenly, across time and place. So when someone says, the first computer was American, the most useful response isn't necessarily to argue, but to ask, first by which definition, because that question opens the door to a deeper, more honest conversation about what computing is, how it developed, and why certain stories became dominant while others faded into obscurity. And if there's one lesson worth taking from this story, it's that innovation thrives when ideas circulate freely, when credit is shared generously, and when history is allowed to be complex rather than convenient, because complexity, unlike myth, can actually teach us something. If you've made it this far, you already appreciate that kind of nuance, so if you enjoyed this deeper dive into the hidden history behind one of the most important technologies ever created, consider leaving a comment with your take on who you think deserves more recognition in the story of computing, and if you want more episodes that unpack the myths behind famous inventions, a like and a subscription really do help keep this kind of content alive. Because the real story of technology isn't about who was first, it's about how ideas survive, spread, and evolve, and that story is far more interesting than any single name on a plaque. And that's the real legacy of the first computer, not a machine, not a country, but a reminder that progress is almost never the work of just one mind, or one place, or one moment.